各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看国际焦点访谈，我是主持人于文琪。今天的来宾是 Richard Fontaine，他是美国著名智库新美国安全中心 Center for New American Security CNAS 的执行长。他在华府呢是外交界的精英哦，曾经在小布希的政府，在白宫国家安全局和国务院任职，也担任过这个已过世有名的参议员麦坎的外交事务助理。他最近和另一位外交界的大佬，也是前白宫的副国家安全顾问 Robert Blackwell 共同出了一本书，叫做《Lost Decade》。细说呢，美国从希拉蕊当国务卿的时候，也就是2011年的时候呢，在外交政策刊物当中宣布这个转向亚洲的政策之后呢，如何是因为各种原因而错失了专注亚洲的这个良机。那这本书呢，是研究美国过去30年来对亚洲政策都必须要读的这一本书哦。书中说到了，美国向来是个以欧洲为外交中心的国家，但是呢，后来多年的中东战争让奥巴马的政府呢决定要把外交的重心转移到亚洲，因为认知到亚洲的重要性。一方面是因为开始呢视中国为外交政策的一个中心哦，因为在长期以来中国可能对美国来做的挑战呢，可能是最大的。那另外一方面呢，是对于整个亚洲呢，希望是能够重新布局，尤其是在军事和经贸方面。但是这本书呢，批评这个政策并没有小心的规划，因此呢，并非所有的政府机构都认同这个政策，并且是一贯的执行哦。那就我当时在国务院任职的经验呢，这还包括了当时美国这个白宫国安局和国务院对于亚洲事务呢，其实有点竞争的这个意味哦。那后来呢，凯瑞担任了国务卿之后，因为他个人的兴趣，又把重心转回了中东。那与此同时呢，当然中国的权力和国力是快速的扩张，不管是军事还是经济，也让其他的国家呢有在美国之外的这个选择的机会哦。另外就是其他国家呢也认为，就是西方还有美国的国力是逐渐下滑，尤其是在军事的部署上面，美国的确是逐渐退出了。那中国呢，与此同时则是大力的提高军事预算和军事的现代化。美国呢，也因为4年一度的选举和政党竞争，造成了外交政策没有办法长期的专注执行，也让其他国家质疑美国的决心、注意力，甚至是能力哦。书中还特别引用了台湾就是前总统蔡英文呢，在美军撤离阿富汗的时候说，台湾被迫必须要加强自身的防卫能力，不能够靠外力来帮助，显示呢也是对美国的信心开始动摇。那在台湾问题上呢，我还特别问他了，华府近年来是否在台湾政策上有所改变？尤其是因为《金融时报》这几天报道说，习近平去年在一个与欧洲领导人的会议上呢，说美国是要诱骗中国来侵犯台湾，但是呢，中国不会上钩。那习近平的他的说法是呢，华府的改变呢，其实是以对中国政策为主。也因为这样呢，过去可能希望两岸是可以自行协商，现在呢，则是希望台湾能够加强自我防卫的能力，尤其是台湾人民现在好像大多数对于统一没有太大的兴趣哦，所以我们今天特别请到他来分享对台湾的看法，请看一下我们的专访。Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen Yu. Today's guest is Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security, a DC-based think tank. Richard is well known in the foreign policy circle. He recently co-authored the book, Lost Decade, The U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. He served in the George W. Bush administration's White House National Security Council, State Department, and the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was a foreign policy advisor to the late Senator John McCain. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
So why did you and Ambassador Robert Blackwell write this book? Can you share what the pivot to Asia policy is, obviously, briefly, especially as it relates to China and Taiwan?
Well, there's a consensus in Washington, or at least a rough consensus, that China represents the greatest long-term challenge to the United States for combining both the will and the capability to upend elements of the regional and global order. And yet the United States has struggled to focus on Asia as a region and China in particular as a set of issues, given everything else that's going on in the world over the past years, especially wars in the Middle East, the events in Europe, and so forth. So we wanted to look at the history of that effort, going back to 2011, when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton published a subsequently famous article saying the United States would pivot to Asia, wind down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, sort of keep resources and attention stable in Europe, and focus more time, attention, and resources on Asia. TPP trade agreement, more military resources, stepped up diplomacy. And so we wanted to look at how that effort did or did not come about over the years, and what it could tell us about the effort to focus on China and Asia today.
And so, as it relates to Taiwan, did you feel like the Asia pivot policy, of course, anything related to China in some way touches on Taiwan? Did you feel like there's at that time Asia pivot policy, factor Taiwan into the picture?
It did, but in a different way, I think, than we think about our policy toward Taiwan now, because the policy toward China was different. It was an engagement policy toward China. And the notion was that by pivoting to Asia and solidifying relationships in the Indo-Pacific, that would allow for a more cooperative U.S.-China relationship across all issues, potentially including Taiwan. That was in the Obama administration. The Trump administration, of course, came in and said, no, it's actually not about engaging China or the possibilities of cooperation. This is fundamentally competitive. And the Biden administration has picked up that sort of same disposition. And now I think policy toward Taiwan, which has been, a policy of U.S. support, I think, throughout, remains, and in some ways has stepped up, but for different reasons, more to defend and deter Taiwan, and less in the hopes of some sort of collaborative partnership with China.
Yeah, I think what this book is really important is actually for those who want to understand the rationale and also the history of the U.S. thinking on Asia and China, to take a look, because it's a detailed review of the last 20 to 30 years. I do want to focus on sort of things that you guys pointed out, especially how, even though 2011, Secretary Clinton announced this policy, but it seems like it wasn't really a well-coordinated interagency national strategy. So in reality, you've also pointed out how it wasn't really backed up by, resource reorientation and priorities, et cetera. And, after Clinton left the government, then John Kerry pivoted back to the Middle East. We know that's sort of, his passion. So do you think today DC has a real sort of understanding of, or consensus of prioritizing Asia? Or is it, again, going to be distracted based on individual interests?
Yeah, it partially is pivoting to Asia, but only partially and only belatedly. So the title of our book is Lost Decade. And we look at the period from 2011, when the pivot to Asia was announced, through 2021, when Joe Biden came into office, really as a time, both in the Obama and the Trump administrations, of lost opportunity, because we didn't see significant reorientation of military resources to the Indo-Pacific, a sustained emphasis on stepped up diplomacy. Or
so why is that? Why is there that sort of policy level, right, and then there's the reality?
Well, it depends on which area you're looking at. But for example, on the military resource side, the pivot was premised in part on the notion that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were winding down and there would be a peace dividend, and some of those resources could be shifted to Asia. Well, as we know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't end at that time. The U.S. withdrew all of its troops from Iraq in 2011. They went back in 2015 to fight off ISIS in a big 5-year campaign. Afghanistan went on for another decade. And at the same time, you had the Budget Control Act, the sequestration that put a huge reduction, $500 billion in defense spending. So you had a smaller pie of defense resources and not as much as they thought would be allocated to Asia after all. Or on the economic side, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, was the centerpiece of the economic pivot. And that was negotiated and kind of good to go. But then in 2016, it got caught up in presidential politics, and it wasn't able to get through the Congress. And so there went our trade policy. And so you can sort of look at different reasons for this. Strikingly, none of the reasons have to do with people saying, well, the pivot's a terrible idea, we shouldn't focus on Asia. Everyone seems to now understand that Asia is a priority region. But of course, the U.S. remains a global power with its own domestic politics and its interests and commitments in other regions. So it's how you balance those things that's been the really difficult aspect of this.
Yeah, you mentioned domestic politics, right? And you mentioned how whether it is, the budget or, just sort of, being focused in terms of resources in the government is just all competing different agendas. So let's talk about domestic politics first. How much is that playing a role in sort of why the Asia pivot policy fell short? Do you feel like there's a partisan difference, or it's not really partisan difference? It's just, the election cycles and, democracy and, trying to compete in elections, and therefore kind of it's hard for foreign policy to be very consistent and sustained for a long time.
Well, the domestic politics around particular issues ended up getting in the way of a pivot to Asia. Not because people were opposed to the pivot, but for example, the domestic politics between Republicans and Democrats, they got together and said, well, we have to work out some deal on overall government spending. And next thing you know, you have sequestration, which is this $500 billion cut in the defense budget. That wasn't specific or had anything intended to do with the pivot, but what it amounted to is a reduction in the resources available for the Indo-Pacific. Or TPP, no one was said, well, we shouldn't pivot to Asia and therefore shouldn't have TPP. But by 2016, it got caught up in presidential politics, and suddenly trade policy in general was very unpopular. And you had the two candidates on the Republican side that remained for president, and the two presidential candidates on the Democratic side, including Secretary Clinton, all coming and saying they didn't like TPP. And then, of course, when Donald Trump came in, he pulled the U.S. out. And so those are the kind of domestic political forces that have been some of the reasons why the pivot has not achieved everything that its architects would have liked.
Yeah, but it seems like the U.S. domestic politics, and in particular, has been a concern to many around the world. Because the question is less about whether the foreign policy circle or elites want to, push certain strategy or policy, but more, can the U.S. Congress or administration actually deliver it? Would you say that's the right description of what's going on in D.C.?
Yes. I mean, I travel internationally a lot, and the two big questions that I often get are, first, the first series is, will Donald Trump be reelected? And if so, what will he do? And then two, irrespective of whether Trump is reelected or not, does the United States have enough political unity to pull together and be able to solve big national challenges? And on the first one, pretty hard to say. My crystal ball on who's going to win the election is not any better than anybody else's. But on the second one, I think there are grounds for optimism if you look at the overall response to the China challenge. Certainly, the U.S. has not done some of the hard political things that it would need to do on defense spending, on trade, on strategic immigration, things like that. But it has done some things that previously were unthinkable on semiconductors, on a development finance corporation and things like that. And so it's moving in the direction of being able to do these things. But for sure, our domestic political situation is not at its finest moment right now.
Yeah. And I think in your book, it specifically used the example that Taiwan's former president, Tsai Ing-wen, said, Taiwan is forced to boost the island's self-defense after the chaotic drawdown of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. So how can this trust be rebuilt, not just with Taiwan, but around the world?
Well, one, I think it's not a bad thing if our partners and allies boost their own defense capabilities. So I think some of the steps that Taiwan has started to take, whether it's extending the length of conscription or the acquisition of the kinds of weapon systems that would be better suited for the defense of Taiwan and so forth, those are all positive steps. And we also are seeing with our other with our allies in Asia, Japan, for example, doubling defense spending over 5 years, and Australia growing more capable, and so forth. So it's not bad for our partners and allies to be more able to defend themselves. But of course, as you say, there's a certain skepticism about American reliability, and I think that's especially true of Taiwan because we don't have a formal treaty alliance with Taiwan. And so you have President Biden, who 4 times publicly has said that if Taiwan is attacked, he would defend Taiwan against China. If President Trump comes in, who knows what he would say about that. So some of that is going to have to be a matter of performance when a particular presidential administration, what do they actually do? And that I think we're just going to have to see, but that's where the trust will ultimately come from.
Yeah, I think the trust also comes from sort of the changing dynamics in Washington, D.C. And I think for any long time, I would say, policy observer, it's really hard to question whether not to question, I should say, DC's policy towards China has not changed, and with regards to Taiwan as well. And the FT recently just reported that Xi Jinping told European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen that Washington was trying to goad Beijing into attacking Taiwan. Do you think DC has been pushing the line on Taiwan issues, or this is largely sort of Beijing's provocation?
Well, certainly the United States is not trying to goad anyone into attacking Taiwan. I mean, Xi Jinping may believe that, but that is...
why do you think he would perceive the U.S. that way?
Well, I think if you look at what the Chinese have objected to, it's a lot, but some of it is what they see as symbolic moves to strengthen what they would say are the, independence mindedness of Taiwanese, right? So, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei for the first time in 25 years that a Speaker of the House visited Taiwan, or some of the other kind of political moves and things like that.
And so would you say that DC has been pushing the line a little bit, maybe, breaking some of the past precedents?
Well, I mean, there was a precedent for Nancy Pelosi's visit, but it was a 25-year-old precedent. Right. And her successor visited with President Tsai in the United States rather than repeat that exercise, having seen what the Chinese response would be. So I think the Chinese see those kinds of things as whether or not they're truly unprecedented, but they see those as provocative, whether or not we see them as legitimate and wise or not. So I think, I think that's probably how the Chinese see this, but they also have, a fundamental belief, or Xi Jinping seems to have a fundamental belief that the great, rejuvenation of the Chinese nation requires reunification with Taiwan. And most people in Taiwan do not seem to want that. And so there's sort of a fundamental impasse there.
Well, I think, this issue is going to continue to be, unfortunately, a thorn, probably, and the number one red line, to quote China, between U.S. and China. So with the possibility of a second Trump administration, how should this Asia pivot policy materialize in terms of military as well as economic and trade?
Well, I think on the military side, we need a significant increase in the defense budget, period. So we're at a moment in time when there's obviously significant instability in the world and a significant demand on U.S. military resources, a war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, and we're still trying to pivot to Asia.
What would be considered significant? Like, what would be an ideal percentage increase from your point of view?
Well, we're right now, in terms of a percentage of GDP, we're about 3% of GDP, which is about the same as we were in 1999 at the height of the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. So moving in the direction of 4%. I mean, these numbers get very round, so it depends on what you buy and where you put it and all that. But, something significant would be, I think, on offer. And then you need, of course, to look at what specific capabilities you're buying and whether they're best suited for the Indo-Pacific, which is important here too. So more military resources dedicated to the Indo-Pacific to increase deterrence, and then making sure that those are devoted to the right kinds of things. That's obviously important. And then on trade, I mean, if there's one thing that both President Biden and President Trump are consistent in, they don't really like trade agreements. But I guess in my sort of wilder moments, I imagine that, Trump could do a Nixon to China on TPP or something. After all, he sold USDA to the Congress with some cosmetic changes over NAFTA. And, to see both the economic and the strategic value of re-engaging in a pan-Asian trade agreement. And by the way, there should be a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. And there's a lot of other things that should be possible besides digital trade agreements and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone talks about, refocusing U.S. efforts in Asia, but with, two major conflicts still ongoing in the world, and obviously the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, seems like, this administration is not going to decrease its commitment. What should be the right approach? Because you're not really advocating for withdrawing any support for Ukraine, right? But how can it be done to really balance the right amount of commitment and resource orientation to Asia?
Yeah, so some people will say, well, the way to pivot to Asia is to more or less abandon U.S. engagement in Europe and let the Europeans sort of step up and figure things out for themselves, or maybe the same thing in the Middle East. And I think that those would be misguided for a variety of reasons. One, I mean, the United States remains a global power, not a regional one, and we have interests and commitments in Europe and the Middle East that aren't going away just because China is a challenge, because the Indo-Pacific is important. It's about how you balance those things. And, so I was saying, more resources overall would allow for more resources, especially in the military domain in the Indo-Pacific. If we, started to have a trade policy again, just because we have a trade policy in Asia doesn't mean we can't have a trade policy somewhere else. That's not quite zero sum. The diplomacy is sort of the hardest thing to manage, just because there's still only 24 hours in a day. And, if the Secretary of State and the President are going off to Europe or spending time in the Middle East, then, that may cut into what they're able to do in the Indo-Pacific in terms of engagement. But, if we fast forward to, say, 2025 and, God willing, the war in Gaza has, stopped or at least significantly died down. Maybe the war in Ukraine is starting to decrease in intensity. So then you have the potential to open up that diplomacy for more focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're advocating for increasing resources and obviously the budget, but that's largely defense oriented. So I want to ask, because this book doesn't say much about how the U.S. can be more competitive in areas of technology innovation or other areas. So do you have a view in those sort of newer, areas, or you feel like, again, right, it's less urgent and we really need to focus on defense and trade?
No, we just had to make decisions about what to include and what not in the book, and so we focus mostly on the external, what will we do externally. But of course, in order to compete more effectively with China, we need to build up our own sources of strength, and also look at what kinds of economic and technology engagements empower China disproportionately. And so that gets at export controls on key technologies, the building up of our own innovation at home. I mean, semiconductors is a part of this, but that's just the beginning. I think, for example, the United States should have a strategic immigration policy where we have many students coming to the United States, including getting PhDs in STEM fields, that they're kind of world-class minds on these issues, and then they can't stay because they don't have a visa to work in the United States afterwards. I mean, so we educate some of the best minds, and then they go contribute to somebody else's economy, China's or somebody else's. Let's keep as many here as want to stay, contributing to our economy, build up our own innovation, our own competitive advantage vis-a-vis China and others. And so, through immigration, through export controls, through key strategic investments in elements of innovation where there's a national security edge, those are the kinds of things that we need to do. We're doing some of that when it comes to the spending money on semiconductors and things like that. We're not doing that when it comes to things like immigration.
And do you feel like if, again, there's a second Trump administration, some of the policy recommendations will be taken up? Because, I think, if just reading news headlines, it feels like a lot of what the second Trump administration will do is on immigration issues, as you said, it may not go in that direction. Or even, engagement with the world or trade issues. So what should we do?
Yeah, on immigration, it's hard. I hope that immigration policy of the sort that I just described will no longer be conflated with the issue of illegal immigration across the southern border. I mean, these are just very different things, and you can deal with one, and you could try to reduce one and increase those who are coming and staying in the United States who, contribute to a high-tech economy, for example. Politically, that seems difficult for our leaders to sort of, be able to talk about, but they should be able to do that. And I think in a second Trump administration, they could. Trade, I think, is the big question mark under Biden or Trump, whether either one of them in their second term will feel freer to pursue some sort of trade policy in the Indo-Pacific. I hope so, but I can't tell you for sure that will happen. I would say overall, in the area that we're talking about in China policy and Indo-Pacific policy writ large, I think you're likely to see more continuity from Biden to Trump than almost in any other area. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration's approach to China and to Asia, it's much closer to the Trump administration's approach than it is to the Obama administration's approach. Right. And that's because there's some consensus that is sort of congealed here that doesn't actually obtain when it comes to Europe or Russia, for example, or, even Israel and some things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that could probably come for certain, many countries who have questions whether there's going to be some major changes in the U.S. in terms of foreign policy, if there's going to be more consistency. But, thank you for joining us today, Richard. Lost Decade, I think it's a very important book for anyone who's trying to understand U.S. relationship with Asia in the last 3 decades. And hopefully it will be available in Taiwan soon. So thank you and take care.